Welcome to ExplainerCast, episode 23. I'm your host, Dave Smith.
And this is Shane Swenson.
Today, we're going to be explaining color perception.
Right, so specifically human color perception. So how do we see
Yes.
colors in our world? I know that other creatures can see things differently, and unfortunately don't know enough to actually explain much about them, but we'll talk about humans today.
All right. And I think we're pretty well qualified because, contrary to some speculation, Shane and I are humans.
That's right, most of the time.
Yeah, for the most part. So it's really simple, right? Like there's three primary colors. You mix them together to get secondary colors. And is that the full extent of it?
And then ternary or tertiary, whatever comes next. Yeah, so I guess my goal today would be to talk about maybe some of the why behind that and where that description is more true and where it's less true. And I guess as an engineer, why do I even care? And both of us work with computers, and it turns out computers have taken advantage of a really interesting property of human visual and specifically color perception to be able to replicate the experience of looking at full color environments through a screen.
Yeah.
The more you understand about this, at least for me, the more kind of shocked I am that this works. But it does. We use it every day. So we'll try to explain why.
Yeah, it is kind of, yeah. I mean, ultimately the puzzle is we've got this flat rectangle that we can cause to replicate pretty much any color that we can otherwise perceive outside in the real world.
Yeah, at least enough of them that we don't notice the ones that are missing.
Ooh.
And so that's part of it. And so as we talk about how color actually exists in the world, maybe we'll start to see why the way we do it is, I guess, to me, pretty surprising. So maybe we start with, let's define what color actually is. So Dave, you want to have a go at that?
Well, color, oh boy. I mean, I've got a few wild things I could say about it because, so just full disclosure, this is not my area of expertise. So I'm going to play the inquisitive, curious host today, and Shane's going to be the expert. But I'll just say a few things that I think I know.
Sure.
Which is color is strictly a psychological phenomenon.
Okay.
The thing that we perceive as color as a human being is, as far as the universe is concerned, indistinguishable from things that we would not call a color. Like, for example, X-rays or radio waves.
Yeah.
It just so happens to be that they are the same physical phenomenon operating within a spectrum that our biology is attuned to perceive and cause to show up in our brain as imagery.
Yeah. So let me break that down even a little further. And we'll start by saying we're talking about light. And light is an electromagnetic wave. And these waves have the property that any given electromagnetic wave oscillates at a specific frequency.
Mm-hmm.
Due to things that I don't really understand involving quantum physics, there's this wave-particle duality. So we talk about either a photon, which is the particle version, or a wave, which is the wave version. And in either case, they have a specific frequency or rate of oscillation. And so that's measured in cycles per second. And I think with the visible light spectrum we're talking about trillions of cycles per second, like the terahertz range, if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, all electromagnetic waves behave in the same fundamental physical manner. And so radio waves, which oscillate much more slowly, thousands or millions of times per second, are electromagnetic waves. And then the really high speed waves you mentioned, like X-rays or gamma rays, they're just very fast oscillating, which also correspond to higher energy instantiations of those waves or those particles. And we as humans have the ability to perceive through our eyes a very relatively narrow range of those frequencies as visual light. And we call that portion of the spectrum the visual light spectrum. And by spectrum, we mean a range of values, frequencies, or as we'll see, colors that we can individually discern within that spectrum, or again, within that range.
So here I want to ask you if I should correct myself on your first question, the answer I gave, which is I said that the only difference between this part of the electromagnetic spectrum is our ability to perceive it. But in reality, that's not true because some parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, for example, can pass through opaque walls and some parts can't.
Yeah, so I mean, if you go from extremely low frequency, very long wavelength, up to extremely high frequency, very short wavelength, things change all along the electromagnetic spectrum. Like very long waves pass through kind of everything without interacting with it. And very short waves
Yeah.
tend to be absorbed very readily by materials. They interact at the molecular level with those materials. So, in a way, yes, each kind of band or range is different, but there aren't really like specific boundaries, at least in the
Okay.
electromagnetic domain, except those that are determined by other things like our ability to perceive them, or maybe a certain material's absorption versus transmittance or reflectance of those wavelengths.
Got it. So there is a little bit of a coincidental alignment between the visible light that we can perceive and the ability of that light to pass through certain materials
Yeah.
and not. But that's strictly coincidental, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably
Or is it?
somewhat bounded by physics. So, like really long radio waves, those measured in, when the wavelength is measured in meters or longer,
Mm-hmm.
the wavelength tends to interact with materials that are of the same size dimension as the wavelength. So, like if you're building a
Oh, I
radio
see.
antenna, you often want to make it like a quarter or a half or a full wavelength in order to capture that energy from that wave and then measure it. And so, the fact that we're working with cellular structures like in our retina kind of defines a certain size range. Like we're not going to make something that can be easily tuned to wavelengths that are, down to like atomic or subatomic granularity. And
Right.
similarly, we're not going to be able to make biological materials that are sensitive to really long wavelengths in the same way.
Yeah, and I remember many years ago I commented to a coworker just casually, wouldn't it be cool if we could see radio waves? And he said, yeah, except your eyes would have to be like 3-foot diameter.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm like, okay, point, touche.
yeah. And so we have this physical or this visible light spectrum available to us, and it's true that some animals on the high frequency side of that spectrum for us is blue, and some animals can perceive even higher frequency, shorter wavelength, ultraviolet. And then on the other end of the perspective or spectrum is red, the long wavelength side, and below red, like longer wavelength than red, is infrared, and we perceive that often as heat. But I don't know if there are any night vision kind of oriented creatures that can perceive infrared better. I'm actually not sure about that one, but
Not visually, but through other senses for sure.
perhaps, yeah.
And I've heard that snakes have an infrared perception capability. I don't know if that's true.
Okay.
We'll put that in the speculation category.
Yeah. So I would guess, and this is pure speculation, that the human visual perception is what it is because it works. Like it's on a size scale that can be built biologically in a robust fashion, and it's useful. It's a range of perceptions that are helpful to the way that we as humans navigate our environment, and that means that it's worth doing that way.
Yeah. All right. So we've defined kind of like what is color at the wavelength sort of. We kind of only touched on it at the definition, but
Let's get
I
into
guess
it
what we've
now.
really defined is visible light. Like,
Yeah.
what is visible light?
And then, so let's go specifically now. So we did an episode a while back about rainbows, which are one way of sort of taking white light, which is really a mix of all frequencies typically in the visual spectrum, and spreading it out, sorting it by frequency due to the different angles that those individual wavelengths will bend at as they enter or leave a water droplet. And that made a rainbow. And when we see a rainbow, we can actually see the different colors that we're attuned to. And they go, through the standard kind of color map we learn as kids, red, green, blue, red, orange, yellow, green, blue,
Yeah.
indigo, violet, depending on how you learn it. And so red is the long wavelength, low frequency side of that spectrum. And then the blue to violet is the short wavelength, higher frequency side of that spectrum. And then the orange, yellow, green kind of fit in the middle. And the specific definition of color would be to choose one specific wavelength in that range. And if you transmitted light that was solely comprised of that wavelength, our human visual perception would see it as one specific color. So, pick your favorite.
Does that mean that there is an infinite number of colors because there are an infinite number of frequencies?
Yeah, you can slice that as small as you want. And if you can make materials that very reliably emit only a very specific frequency, yes, you can you could get a slightly different color variation. Now, our human visual perception has limits into what we can distinguish between. So two very similar wavelengths that are physically slightly different might show up to us as about the same. We may struggle to tell them apart. And that's just because our perception is not perfectly precise down to the finest detail. There's a little bit of approximation or fuzziness in it.
We round to the nearest perceivable color.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, there's sort of a limited benefit to going with more precision than you can make use of. And our visual.
And here,
perception's
let
that
me
way.
just insert one more piece of speculation, which is off-brand for us, but it was such an interesting fact that I have to throw it out, which is not only is our color perception limited by the physiological shapes of our biology, but also it might be limited by our own linguistics.
Okay.
And this is based on some research that I read about that said the conclusion was the ancient Greeks could not see the color blue. That was the headline. But that was based on research that suggests that if you don't have a name for something, you probably can't perceive it. And there were certain colors that, at least according to this headline, they think that ancient people just couldn't really see. Like they would round to a different color in their perception.
Interesting. Yet I wonder which way it would go. You also wouldn't give names to things you couldn't perceive. So if for some reason
Right.
you didn't have the perception, you wouldn't name it. That's fascinating. And maybe if we get far enough along, we might be able to talk about some of the mechanisms that lead to some of like the common forms of color blindness, for example.
Yes, that'd be great.
Where you can't always tell the difference between some of these colors.
Okay. So I'll leave the speculation zone. No, let's go back to fact zone.
Sounds good. So our definition of a color is that it is what we as humans perceive. Actually, well, okay, there's two definitions. The physics definition of a color would be it's defined as a specific frequency of light, often also referred to as the corresponding wavelength you get if that light is traveling at the speed of light in a vacuum.
Yes.
I don't love the wavelength version of it because that wavelength changes as you move between media. The frequency, I think, is preserved, but light slows down as it moves into other transmission media like a water drop or a piece of glass, in a lens or something like that. So I'll try to remember to try to stick with frequencies. So
Okay.
now the question is, if we've got this bounded range of frequencies that we perceive as colors, and we have potentially infinite variation within that range to pick a specific frequency that we would see and perceive as a color, how biologically do we do it? And this is what's going to lead to the discovery of what was called color theory, where people started to realize that you could make colors, like you could mix things to make colors, and you could do other tricks to pull colors apart. So this is where we get into the anatomy of our eye. And the eye has some important parts to allow light in, to allow the right amount of light in, to focus it back on our retina. And in the back of the eyeball, the retina is the area where we have our ability to perceive light coming in. And have you heard, Dave, of the two kinds of basic light detecting cells in our retina, the rods and cones?
Yeah. Rods and cones. Yes, I've heard about that from elementary school.
Yeah. And so rods and cones have very different jobs. The job of the rods are to simply detect the intensity of light. So sort of darkness to brightness. And human retinas have a huge number of these. I think I saw like more than 100 million per retina.
Whoa.
And they're what give us, again, night vision, and they're quite sensitive, but they don't react quickly to changes in light. On the other hand,
yes.
cones, we have a much smaller number, I think on the order of maybe like 6 million. And they're concentrated in kind of the center of the retina, so the center of our visual field. And they are the elements that are responsible for color light detection. And they require more light to create a stimulus or to be perceived by us. So they work in brighter light conditions, but they also have this key attribute that they specialize as they develop into one of three sensitivity types. Essentially, there's a long wavelength sensitivity, which is going to be sort of in the red range of our visual perception. Then there's a medium wavelength sensitivity, which is going to correspond roughly to greenish. And then there is a short wavelength sensitivity, which corresponds to roughly to blue.
I have a name for these
Okay.
cones. I call them Roy, G, and Biv.
Exactly. Yeah. The fact that they align to what we'll find are the primary colors for additive color when we use light and we shine light is not a coincidence. And this is one of the sort of the crazy things about this. Because we have these three types of sensors, the way your eyeball and brain determine what color you're seeing is essentially by the mixture of brightness or stimulus that these three different types of cones perceive from a given wavelength. So they don't each have like a single frequency they're sensitive to. They each have kind of a range and kind of a mountain-shaped curve, and those ranges overlap. So colors, like a wavelength that is somewhere between red and green, will stimulate the red cones to a certain extent and the green cones to a certain extent, but it really won't stimulate the blue cones at all.
Mm-hmm.
And your brain will then essentially does like some linear algebra to interpolate and say, well, if I'm seeing kind of like half red and half green, I must be somewhere in between the two. So its assumption is there's a single wavelength creating the stimulus, and it's then figuring out what wavelength would create this particular ratio of these three sensors measurements. And then that's the color that our brain perceives.
That's amazing. That's so mind-blowing.
It's crazy. And so then it's basically a mapping problem. You can go in the other direction. So you could say, okay, given a wavelength, if I know the transfer function, I know how sensitive each of the cone types are to every wavelength in the visual spectrum, I actually know what that brain mapping is going to be. And it turns out, this is the crazy part, this is how our computer system works. Once you know that all color perception is simply determined by how much the three different types of cones are activated by that color, you can then synthetically activate those cones in other ways to achieve the same outcome. And what I mean by that is, if I know that a certain color is kind of midway between red and green, what I could actually do is I can actually transmit some red into your eye and some green into your eye, and you'll perceive it as if it were that color in between.
Oh, that's how. Okay. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. It makes so much sense, but it never really occurred to me. I just thought, oh, of course, you're blending the wavelengths, so you must get an additive effect. But actually, no, there is no yellow.
That's right.
Coming out of your computer screen.
Your computer.
There's only red and there is only green, and your mind is doing math.
Yep.
To come up with yellow.
Exactly, because your mind says, well, and you got it, between red and green sit yellow, and your mind is saying, what color, what single wavelength of light am I seeing right now in order to stimulate these cones in this way? And the answer is yellow, if it's like sort of equal red and green.
So it stands to reason that if some alien species showed up and they evolved a different method of perceiving color, where they actually have a different set of cones, like they have a cone specifically for that yellow frequency.
Mm-hmm.
If they looked at our computer screens, they would see no yellow, right?
It would look weird. Yeah, if they didn't have the same transfer function we have, yeah, like if you were to take a spectrometer, like if you were to take the light coming out of your screen, like, and you can do this with flashlights or like just with, color gels. So you talked about in a theater where before we started this, where you've got spotlights or other floodlights that you can put different color gels onto. And so if you literally shine like a red light and then you shine a green light and you overlap them, we'll see it as yellow. And if you add blue, we'll actually see that as white.
We'll see it as white.
But
yeah, it's crazy.
If you were to take that white light and you were to run it through a prism, it wouldn't look like a rainbow. It would look like these three narrow bands of color, the red, the green, and the blue inputs that you put into it.
Mm-hmm. No yellow at all.
No yellow at all.
As long as you separate them out. Yeah.
That's right. And so you don't need yellow light to cause a human eyeball to think it's seeing yellow.
Okay, so backing up then, let's go to paint.
Yep.
If I put some yellow paint on a canvas and look at it,
mm-hmm.
the same trick is not happening here, right? The photons coming off of that yellow paint actually are oscillating at the yellow frequency, right?
So maybe.
How would we know?
Exactly. Well, get out your prism and and see what colors you see there. So when we talk about pigments, the way that pigments tend to interact with light is so when we talked about light transmission, like we're shining photons, we're creating photons somewhere in a bulb, and maybe we're filtering them through a filter, and now those photons are flying out. When we're talking about a pigment, we're talking about reflected light.
Mm-hmm.
And usually what makes a pigment have a color is that it absorbs some of the visual spectrum and it transmits some other portion of the visual spectrum. And often these pigments, as I understand it, have a kind of a broad spectrum of transmission, but they've absorbed some other part of the spectrum. And so this is where when you are mixing paint, and if you look at, say, like an inkjet printer, on an inkjet printer, you don't typically see red, green, or blue ink. You see 3 other primaries. Do you know what they are?
Cyan, magenta,
and yellow.
And then whatever YK stands for.
Yeah. So so cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K is actually black. It stands for key, or like the base color.
Okay.
Back from printing era, I guess, jargon. So the color primaries though are cyan, magenta, yellow, and if you look at those and you compare them to, and so those are called subtractive primaries because they each are in fact subtracting one of the human visual primary colors when you use them. So when you use yellow, what you're actually doing is you're filtering out the blue, and you're keeping the red and the green stimulus that we get from that yellow pigment coming to your eyeball.
Okay.
So even if it is yellow coming out, it's going to specifically stimulate like the red and the green cones, and it's not going to stimulate the blue cone. When you look at cyan in additive color, that's a mix of blue and green, kind of a blue-green color. In pigment, that is subtracting out the red. And so that cyan stimulates your blue and your green cones. It does not stimulate the red. And so now in subtractive color, if you mix cyan pigment and yellow pigment, what you're left with is only the green cone is the shared stimulus between those two. And so we'll perceive that mix of cyan and yellow as green. And you can do this with like crayons too, like the blue and yellow makes green. We say blue, but really cyan is kind of closer to the right pigment color to use.
And when you say right, you mean the one that our cones are optimally tuned to?
Yeah, the one that'll create the largest range of colors that we can perceive when you're mixing quantities of that primary from a pigment standpoint.
Okay, and is that why cyan, magenta, and yellow were chosen for printing, is because they are like straight down the center of the tuned range for the cones?
Yeah, they're sort of like the wavelength inverses of the red, green, and blue that our cones actually use. And so finally, magenta is kind of an equal mix of blue and red, and so it sort of makes your eye think that it's not green. That's the one I don't actually understand very well, since green sits between red and blue in the wavelength spectrum. I haven't wrapped my head around this, but somehow it works like your brain treats it like it's a triangle as opposed to a line between those 3 color values.
That kind of makes sense. Like, why would our eyes understand that these things are frequency neighbors, you know?
Right.
Oh man, you're sorry. My brain is just like super stimulated right now. Very interesting. Yeah. Okay. Also, the triangle comment hit me kind of between the eyes, because a lot of times the color palette is represented as such.
Right. Yeah. And you think about like the color wheel, again, going to color theory, which again, artists discovered a long time ago before computer people came around to it and photography people came around to it. They realized that you actually don't need every color of paint. You can get away with a subset of these colors. And often they were referred to as red, blue, yellow. But the challenge is if you use conventional red and blue, you're sort of limited. You sort of get these more like darker, muted tones. Whereas if you use like a very light or bright blue, something more kind of cyan-like, that increases the range of possible colors you can mix. And then similarly, if you push your red kind of more towards that pinkish magenta direction, again, it increases the gamut or the set of colors you can actually mix with paint. So artists understood this a long time ago.
Yeah, but without knowing, someone must have kind of realized like, oh wow, our eyes actually only work with 3 kind of ranges.
Yeah, I think they figured this out, and they kind of defined an algebra for it. The other thing that's kind of crazy is we really work with the ratios of these three ranges. So whether a given hue or wavelength of color is very low light, like fairly dim, or fairly bright, we actually perceive it as about the same color, across multiple orders of magnitude in the power level or the quantity of that light that's coming into our eye, which is another convenient, but in a way kind of surprising outcome, that our brain's not making absolute measurements when it's making color decisions or perceptions. It's making relative measurements about the ratio, that our cones are perceiving.
So interesting. And so earlier you said you can mix these pigments like cyan and others, magenta together in certain ratios to produce a new color. But really all you're doing is hacking the inputs into the human eye.
That's right.
Right? Like it's still, all of the photons coming off of that pigment are still just cyan and magenta. It's just what ratio are cyan and what ratio are magenta.
I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not changing the reflectance, or you're not changing the atomic properties that cause frequencies of electromagnetic radiation to be absorbed or reflected, right? Like, so of course.
Yeah, not in physical pigment mixing. Yeah, when you're doing it at kind of call it mechanical scale, where these particles are together, but they're not chemically interacting. Like, sure, there's chemical interactions that can change like the actual frequency of light, but yeah, here we're just changing the distribution or the ratios.
Yeah, that's so amazing. So earlier when I said, oh, now you've got yellow, you were like, well, maybe. And I'm like, okay, I get it now. Like, actually, that's also just perception.
And actually, if you look at, so if you take like a piece of color printed paper, like out of a book or magazine or something, and you magnify it, you'll see those primaries like as individual like little dots or splotches. And as long as those are small enough and close enough together that we're not able to distinguish them, so we could talk about some other time, maybe spatial resolution, like we can't distinguish things that are too close together. They sort of blur into being a single thing from our eyeballs perspective. We again perceive those independent colored blobs as effectively having been mixed into what our brain then says, I'm going to apply the Occam's razor, the principle of simplest explanation to this, and say there must be one color being emitted there. I'm going to call it, blue or whatever it is that I see.
And here is where I'm going to give a product pitch. Not really, I'm just kidding. But one of my favorite Amazon purchases of all time was a small handheld microscope. You may have seen these, Shane, where they have like surprising magnification for being about the size of a smartphone, but a little thicker.
Yeah.
And you can place this on printed paper, and you look into the eyepiece, and you can see the dots from the printing broken out. And you can even put it on a screen.
Yes.
And you can actually see the same phenomenon with the red, green, and blue pixels coming out of your monitor or your phone. It's really cool.
That's super cool. And so, yeah, if you put it on paper, I would guess you're more likely to see those subtractive primaries, the cyan, magenta, yellow. If you put it on your screen, a lit screen, an active screen like your phone or your computer or your laptop, you'll see the red, green, and blue colors coming out.
That's right. And they're not on top of each other. They are neighboring red, green, and blue pixels. And since there's only 3 and it needs to be organized in a grid, you just have these like red will be on top, green will be below it, and blue will be to the right. And then there'll be a blank spot, in one of the quadrants. And then you move to the next grouping of pixels. It's really cool.
Wow.
And also it depends on the kind, when you're looking at paper, it depends on the kind of printer you have. Like if you take an old comic book, or probably even a new comic book, you can actually see all the little circles where it was printed. It's really cool up close. I don't know what you would see on like a more modern like laser printer or something, but it's probably similar.
Yeah, it may just be at finer resolution.
Yeah.
So you need a higher magnification. In some cases, I think there are types of printing where they intentionally sort of blend dyes together so that you wouldn't be able to separate it. But yeah, the conventional, I think it's maybe called halftone type shading, where you just vary the size of the dots of the different colors in kind of these discrete gridded areas. And as you zoom out, again, it kind of smooths out and our eye perceives it as a continuous shape, a continuous line, a continuous color.
Really cool. It's amazing.
Yeah. So that's like the grand sort of engineering hack is we have 3 types of color perception. And if we target those 3 colors directly, either through emitted light or through pigment, we can create at least a broad range. And you said, can we create every color humans perceive? Most of these technologies don't cover the full spectrum of human visual perception, but they cover enough of it that it usually works for most use cases. But you are making a little compromise when you kind of choose the corners of that triangle of colors you'll be able to generate with a given technology.
Very cool.
Over Christmas, we watched The Wizard of Oz, the kind of the original, what was it, 1950s or so version that is black and white in when they're in Kansas, and then it turns to color.
So I have some news for you. This is going to make you feel old, since I know you probably saw Wizard of Oz when it came out in the theaters in the 50s.
Yeah.
Actually, it came out in 1939.
No way. Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I was only off by almost 20 years. Okay. So
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's so old. Crazy.
Anyway, yes, you're right. Well, this makes it all the cooler that they were able to do this color film technique all the way back in 1939. And so if we talk just a little bit about, black and white versus color photography, and I haven't made a deep study of this, but I made a very shallow study of this. So the first thing you need a material that is sensitive to the intensity of light. So we'll call that photographic plates or photographic paper or film, something that you expose it to light and it changes based on how much light it got. And it's easiest to make that sensitive to maybe a broad spectrum of light. So that gives you basically like a light to dark gradient, or what we would call like black and white or monochrome photography. And the way that they filmed the color sequence for The Wizard of Oz was using a technology called Technicolor. And the tech in Technicolor is both because it was a technology, but also because it came out of MIT, which they refer to themselves as tech. And the trick with Technicolor was they took the light coming into the camera, they beam split it multiple times, sent it through 3 different colored filters, a red, a green, and a blue filter, and then exposed 3 separate monochrome film strips to it. So they literally filmed the movie like simultaneously onto 3 pieces of film,
Whoa.
each of which were monochrome film, but filtered to those 3 colors. Then they develop and then finally print those 3 different film strips representing those 3 primary colors onto 3 separate pieces of colored film, basically that would be a red, from like basically from white to dark, but going all through the red colors, and then one for blue and then one for green. And then they laminated them back together.
Oh my gosh.
And so the light would shine from the projector through the 3 layers, through the red layer, the green layer, the blue layer, and whatever light made it all the way through would hit the screen, and then your eye would perceive that as color.
Wow. That's so cool. So again, it's ratios, right? Like
Yep.
the different film strips were different. They would either attenuate or pass through light of that color at different intensity levels.
Yep.
And the mixture your mind perceives as whatever color it wants.
Exactly.
Now,
So
I have to believe that means that the colors you saw on the film were probably pretty different from the colors you saw if you were standing on set watching it in real life.
I think, something I read about it, there were a couple things. And so that color, the Technicolor look was the super bright, saturated color. Like it's like, when it's colorful, it's very colorful. And so it's a little hyper realistic in that way. And I wonder if maybe they even had to choose some aspects of the sets and costumes and so forth to kind of deal with the way that color was reproduced through that process. Also, I read that it takes an insane amount of light to create enough brightness to expose, after the beam splitting, to like expose all of the 3 colors of film
to survive all of the pathways.
Exactly. And so it was like really hot on set because you're just under these extremely intense lights. Yeah. And then in the other industry where Technicolor, of course, was highly utilized was in animation, where you're making synthetic color, because now you could just synthesize these different color layers and then combine them together to create that kind of highly saturated cartoon color look. But just another way of hacking human visual perception. So people understood this a long time ago and then started figuring out how to make use of it.
That's so cool. So cool.
Yeah. And so now if you look at computers, this hits us in a couple of ways. One of them is that we can have these really beautiful screens that only need to have the ability to make 3 colors of light, red, green, and blue. And they can do that now using modern silicon light emitting diodes that are tuned to those frequencies. And they need to do it at varying intensities, but That's also easily done electrically with today's technology. And you can store information about the image you want to produce by just storing for each picture location, each pixel, which is basically just a grid of dots on the screen, how much of those three colors you want, how much red, how much green, and how much blue. And that's what modern image files look like, is a grid of those three colors that then tell your screen how bright to make each of those elements on the screen. And then we see it as photograph level realistic imagery with our eyes.
And ultimately, all computerized image formats are encoding that grid at some point, because I remember the very first binary file format that I ever looked into to figure out what it was the bitmap format, or .bmp files.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's literally all they were. It was just, depending on whether it was, I think there was different resolutions you could have.
Yep.
But it was just like an 8-bit red number followed by an 8-bit green number followed by an 8-bit blue number, and just repeat for the length of the file.
Yep.
And you had to know the width and the height, and I think that was encoded at the front of the file or something.
Yep.
And that was it. That was like that may have been some of the first image files. It was certainly the first ones I was ever exposed to.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, interesting. It's just a mix of RG and B intensities across the whole grid of whatever you want to display.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about the simplest possible way to represent what's going to show up on your screen. And so it's, kind of that base case.
There's a whole bunch of modern image file formats that just find ways to more optimally store that, to use less space to still convey the same information.
Right.
But when you decode them and uncompress them, they turn into a grid of RGB values. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they all come back to a grid of RGB, all the ones I can think of. And then if you're going to display on a screen, that's basically it. You then send those values to the screen and say, this is how bright to make each of your picture elements. If you're going to print, you then have to go through essentially with a couple of mathematical transforms to say, okay, this is what I was trying to do in the RGB color space. How much cyan, magenta, or yellow, and maybe some black do I need to use to create the same visual perception?
Or the closest one,
or
right? Like
the best I can do. That's right. Because they don't perfectly align. And so that's where you get, there's all kinds of definitions for this. There are a set of things called color profiles that essentially describe how to create mappings between any representation of color that usually originated either as an input, like an image, like a picture that was taken, or one of those RGB representations of what you want to display, and then can map it out either to a specific screen technology, which might be different than the standard RGB color space, which was really defined around the older cathode ray tube, like the big monitors that we had up kind of through the 90s and the way those worked.
Mm-hmm.
And then when LCDs came out, they essentially just replicated that same mapping to brightness of each color. And so devices that work that way just kind of naturally use those colors, and then devices that use some other set of primaries like printed just have a transfer function essentially to find the closest possible mapping.
Very cool. All right. Well, how much more explaining can we do on color? I don't know. It feels pretty well explained.
I was thinking of one more thing. I think so too. I think we talked about how we understand color, how it essentially works in the digital world, and how we made it something that we can create data about and then do computation on. Last thing then is, so we talked about how we've got these 3 different cone types that enable us to see this full spectrum of colors. This biology and changes in this biology are actually what give rise to what's sometimes called color blindness. I think there's better technical terms, but that's all I've got right now. So the most common form of color blindness or reduced color perception in humans that I'm aware of is difficulty perceiving the differences between red and green. And my understanding for how this comes about is most commonly it's genetically linked. The genes that create the red cones versus the green cones are very similar. They just have a small number of differences that result in slightly different proteins that then are sensitive to slightly different wavelengths of light. And so if it turns out the particular genetic makeup for a person doesn't preserve all of those differences, their red and green cones can end up being essentially sensitive to the same wavelength of light. And they don't have the ability to distinguish the range between red and green. And that affects those 2 primaries, but it also affects all the colors that are dependent on the ratio between those 2 being different. And so it takes sort of 1/3 of that color measurement triangle out of the equation, and you're left with a color line effectively, over to the blue side.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So it's like, I hadn't occurred to me that that's all that is that you still have all the cones. It's not like you don't have green cones.
Right.
Or rather, the cones that should otherwise be green.
Yep.
But rather, you've got them. They're just tuned slightly wrong.
Right.
They're picking up red instead of green.
Exactly. And I can't remember if it's more likely that the green drifts toward the red or the red drifts toward the green, or maybe they both have this property. But yeah, the result is that if you sort of can't tell them apart, then they're not useful for the function they're supposed to have, which is to distinguish between those two primaries, or at least wavelengths in between those ranges.
Yeah, and interestingly, people who have red-green color blindness have described it to me as that reds and greens kind of look brown or gray to them.
Yeah, which you think about an equal mix of color, that's the black to gray to white spectrum, and so the fact that that's sort of perceived as there must not be a pure color here, it must be this kind of more white light, just attenuated mix. It's kind of a natural, again, conclusion for your brain to come to when it's trying to say, what do I make of this data set that I'm seeing here that doesn't have a distinct ratio between the two?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, now kind of in the context of 3 types of cones and 2 of them are perceiving
The same.
Yeah, I wonder if that means that other colors are also just like even things in the blue range. Well, I guess those other 2 cone sets wouldn't necessarily pick up the blues anyway, but I was going to say maybe it would cause for all color perception to be kind of muted as a result of it, but
I could see it reducing, but yeah, I think as you get closer to blue, the reality is that blue is the shortwave side, and the other 2 are kind of, the long and the medium, they're actually pretty close to each other in their wavelength that they're sensitive to. So I would guess your brain has a stronger ability to detect blue from not blue than it does in the red-green range.
So interesting.
But again, I haven't lived this. I don't actually know what it's like. But yeah, I've heard similar descriptions.
Yeah, and color's one of those things that I've often found hard, like philosophically hard to talk about because, and people will say things like, well, how do you know that when you see the color yellow, someone else perceives that the same way?
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know, but I know they have the same number of cones as I do, and they probably perceive some ratio very similar. And so unless their brain is doing very different math, they probably see yellow the same way I see it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. If it's not just sort of left wide open. And I agree. You can test and measure that people have a range of variance, but fundamentally are capable of distinguishing, for the most part, the same sets of colors and kind of generally agree on the size of step needed to say, that's a different shade or a different color. So, we're doing similar math. We have similar sensitivities. And yeah, it kind of makes sense that maybe there's like a convenient or a helpful way of representing color. And when you talk about people about like their emotional attachments to colors, we tend to have similar emotional attachments to reds versus blues, as an example. I don't know how much of that might be culturally derived versus biologically derived. So maybe other societies would come to different conclusions. But again, Occam's razor, I think, kind of says, assume you perceive things more similarly than not, unless there's evidence otherwise. That's probably where I'd go with it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
But yeah, I don't know of any good way to directly test it. So it is a bit of a mystery.
I know, right? Get their brain to hook up to an HDMI cable and project the image that it perceives.
There you go. Close the loop.
Well, do we have any more explaining to do?
I think that probably does it.
All right. We had some explaining to do. We did some explaining. Thanks, Shane. That was really fascinating. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely, Dave.